Today, in this season of Easter, in church life through the centuries, Easter has been thought of as a season and not just the day. They used to call it the Great 40 Days, actually, the days between Easter Sunday and Pentecost, were the days the church would remember in a variety of ways the new life that God makes possible through Jesus Christ. And so we gather today to celebrate that, and are grateful for your presence today. If you're new to the church, we want to say a special word of welcome to you. Encourage all of you. We have an opportunity to register your attendance with those pads that are in each pew, and I would encourage you to do that and give us your contact information. We are appreciative for that information and glad that all of you have come. Pray that we'll be encouraged in our faith as we gather today and drawn close to God. My name is Vaughn Hoffman. I'm the directing minister here, and Camilla, let me let you...
I'm Camilla Hempstead. I'm the associate minister here.
Thank you. Hear the reading for today. It's a lectionary reading from the Gospel. The lectionary is nothing more than the church's prescribed or suggested readings, of course, for a given Sunday. And on this second Sunday after Easter, hear a story about some followers who come into connection with the risen Christ and have a kind of awakening, or as Kathy said, a light bulb moment of their own. Here's the story from the 24th chapter according to Luke. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other as you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" And they replied, "Well, the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in the Scriptures. And as they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead, as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road, while he was opening the Scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened to them on the road, how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God shall stand forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. God, as we gather in this holy season of Easter, we would pray that the resurrection of your Son, Jesus Christ, might not just represent a historical victory of life over death, but that it might be made powerfully real in our hearts this day. Rise us from the tombs that bind us. Give us new insight, new hope. Surprise us with some unforeseen arrival of your grace and your new life in our midst this very day. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I have always considered the weeks after Easter to be a kind of pleasant time to be a preacher, because the prescribed readings are always interesting and full of surprises after this Easter season. It's particularly true of the gospel readings. There is, for instance, that after Easter resurrection story about Thomas. Camilla preached on that last week. Thomas Didymus, Camilla reminded us, known to history as the doubter, but whom, she went on ably to suggest, rose above that stereotype and certainly became worthy of a much higher level of respect than history has tended to afford him. Be careful who you stereotype, the point was. You never know when they'll surprise you with something wonderful. And that was the case of Thomas. And then there was the other after Easter resurrection story, one I especially like, when in a burst of creative genius, the disciples decided that the best way they could deal with all of the stress they had come through with Holy Week was to go fishing. I like that because that's my stress relief too. I tend to go fishing the week after Easter every year as well. This past year was no exception. I found my way up to the trout streams in southwest Wisconsin, up near La Crosse, to spend some time just kind of knee-deep in the cold water, seeing what trout might be willing to bite. And it did remind me, incidentally, that I think there's good reason the apostles decided that after Easter you should go fishing, because there is something about fishing, not just that it was their trade, there's something about fishing that when you're tired or perplexed about something, it's good medicine, because it's impossible to fish and worry at the same time. That's what I maintain. You got so many things you're worrying about. Where's my line going to be? Can I see that little fly drifting in this fast water? Can I watch my drift? Fishing, whether you're a commercial fisherman or a regular fisherman, you got enough to pay attention to that you can't worry so much. Your mind can't wander. And I think for the disciples, they decided fishing was their way of diffusing the perplexity of the moment, what to do next, where are we going to go? And of course, that wonderful story is they're out fishing on the lake and Jesus shows up. He calls to them from the shore, and they're preoccupied. They don't recognize who it is. And finally, after he gives them some unsolicited fishing advice and they catch a boatload of fish, Simon gets the message and he swims to shore. You remember the story, and Jesus has got breakfast cooked there on the shoreline over a charcoal fire, which is an interesting little literary event in itself. You know, the literary folks who study this passage says, you remember the last time there was a charcoal fire was when Peter was standing in front of a charcoal fire on Holy Week, denying Jesus 3 times before a maid, and now here he is, after Easter, back with Jesus in front of a charcoal fire, and Jesus says, Simon, do you love me? 3 times he does that, just like Peter had denied him 3 times, and it's this wonderful story about forgiveness, Peter being brought back into the fold, as if to say, yeah, you let me down, but it's not the end for you. There's more life out ahead of you. And it's that wonderful reconciliation, wonderful story of new life that, Jesus hadn't given up on Peter even when Peter had given up on himself. So that's, 2 after Easter resurrection stories. And then there's the one we got for today. In my opinion, it's the best. And certainly it's the most famous. 2 followers. Cleopas. We never know any more about Cleopas than we learn about him in this one story. And another follower who the writer Luke doesn't even name, but they are a part of the community. They're not as famous as the 11, of course, who are back in Jerusalem, but there they are out walking just hours after the resurrection has been announced by these women who've gone to the tomb on Easter morning. They are out walking, and they are sad, this text says. They're downcast, and they are on the road to Emmaus. Emmaus is just a little village 7 miles outside of Jerusalem. And this text says that as they are walking out of town, dejected, trying to make sense of the rumors that they're hearing, also processing what's happened in the days they've just come through, seeing Jesus brutally killed on Good Friday by the Romans, and now wishing they could believe the resurrection news, but not sure that they want to do it. Sounds, the old saying, if a thing sounds too good to be true, probably is. I think that was kind of what was in their hearts as they walked down that road. And according to Luke, it's while they're thinking about all this and stewing on it and arguing about it together, reasoning things out, that's when things start to change. Luke writes it like this: "And while they were talking among themselves and arguing, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him." And the story then goes on. Jesus enters this conversation. "What are you guys talking about?" And they tell him. Well, maybe you're the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard this, but what we're arguing about, what we're trying to make sense of, what we're hashing out here is what to make of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus who did all these great works. Surely you've heard of him. Jesus whom we had hoped would be the one who'd redeem Israel and transform all of our lives. But just 3 days ago, the Romans have killed him. And now some women have said the strangest thing. They've said they've seen him alive again. That's what we're trying to figure out. And I have to say, if you think about that story, them walking along in that state of mind and Jesus beside them, I really like that picture of the Christian faith that's lifted up in that very text. These two followers exercising their reason, engaging their minds, trying to get their heads around what it means to be a person of the resurrection, one of the greatest questions of faith you could ever ask. And in the midst of that, Jesus comes to them. And he comes, I want you to notice, not to scold them. He doesn't come and say, "Why all this questioning and all this doubting? Why all this reasoning it out? Just faith is all you need. Why all this conversation?" He doesn't do that at all. He comes and he joins in the questioning. "What are you talking about? Tell me, let me in on the conversation. Let me in on the debate. Mind if I walk along? I like a good discussion myself." That's the picture that's painted there in Luke 24. And I have to say, it's a point that needs to be said in the church from time to time. The simple point that engaging our minds and asking honest questions and trying to think for ourselves in moments when we're stressed and not sure what to make of it, those things are not the enemy of religion that we sometimes have folks tell us they are. So often people will posture religion as being all about stopping conversation, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That bumper sticker? Rarely does a bumper sticker make good theology, and this is one of those times, So often religion is postured as that which suppresses thoughtful reflection, and that questions are thought to be a negative in the whole process, But here in this Emmaus Road story, we see Jesus has a different opinion. And actually, if you think more about it, that's not the only place where we get that. Jesus, of course, was a great person to teach in parables, as was the custom of most rabbis in his day. And parables, whatever else you may want to say about parables, parables are designed not to close conversation, but to invite you to think. That was the typical way Jesus did. Somebody would come to him with a question that he rarely gave a cut and dried answer to. "Who's my neighbor?" They would say to him, and that they would know very well, many of them, that there could be a cut and dried answer to the question, "Who's my neighbor?" In the law, the Old Testament law, it was spelled out. Your neighbor was the person who was of the same tribe as you, the same faith as you. And instead of answering like that, Jesus would spin a yarn and get them to think. "Well, a man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among the thieves who stripped him and robbed him and left him," and then, tell the story of the Good Samaritan. The priest goes by, leaves him. The Levite goes by, leaves him, and the Samaritan binds him up, the hated Samaritan. And the story would conclude, and then Jesus would look back at the person who wanted a pat answer and say, so who do you think the neighbor was? It was his way. It was his way. Not to close conversation, not to see faith as a way of narrowing you, but of broadening you and encouraging you to engage yourself in these deep questions and to see that life is set in this wonderful mystery and embrace of God, and that there is no truth we can uncover that God is not part of God's nature and God's being. So in the story, you kind of see that. Questioning folks walking down the road of life in a hard moment, and Jesus drawing with them. And in the story, of course, as it unfolds, that stranger stays with them as the miles go by, and the story of their disappointment kind of pours out, and finally, he speaks. This was all prophesied, you know. And then he gives them, according to Luke, a Bible lesson like none they've ever had before. He opened their eyes unto what was written about him. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to know how that unfolded? And we don't know any of the particulars of it, only that when they get to town and come to this inn, they are eager for more. They can't wait to hear more from him. And the text says, interestingly enough, he appeared to be going further, which I take to mean, you know, Jesus never pushes himself on us. True to form, Jesus will not force his way into any life that's not ready to receive him, any place where he's not wanted. It's like that beautiful image. You know that story, the text in Revelation that paints a picture of Christ as being the one. They've made paintings of this in various kinds. Jesus standing at the door knocking on the soul of a person. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, let him open unto me, and I will come in and eat with him. Never forces himself. And the text says, he appeared to be going on further, past the inn. And now they're so eager to be connected to him. They say, oh, please, don't go. Stay with us. Have supper with us. And the passage, of course, then says that around that dinner table that night, he broke the bread, and it clicked. The light bulb went off. It's him. It's him. He's with us. He's back. The women were right. And the text says, and then he vanished from their sight. But of course, the truth is, he had not vanished at all, because they were changed. You know, Cleopas and this other unnamed person, he hadn't vanished from here. You know, he hadn't vanished from who they were now, and would be with them forever. And the text says, run back to Jerusalem. They find the 11, and they bring the news. We've seen him. The women were right. He's risen indeed. And now, we know it. It's not a question of knowing it here. You know, the longest distance a person can travel sometimes is 18 inches from here to here. And now they know it. Now they know it. We've seen him, and we've experienced him. It's such a beautiful story, it seems to me, of how God works, and it's powerful when you think of the fact that all of us find ourselves in those moments when we're just like those two followers on the road, when we're stunned, things have taken us by surprise, we're at a loss to explain things, either how we got where we are or how to know where to go next. It came to my mind this week. I saw those news photos, and I'm sure you did too, in the wake of the tornadoes in Arkansas and Mississippi, and we had the same kind of photographs last fall from Washington, where people you see these folks, they're in the midst of what used to be order in their life, and now it's desolation. You know, their house, their neighborhood, which was all just moments ago normal. It's, desolation and chaos. It looks for all the world like you could never have hope again. Everybody at some point in life finds themselves in that circumstance in some way or other. We all have our Emmaus Road, whether we find it in a flash like that kind of a storm hitting or however it might come. There are moments when we feel like life punches us in the nose. Just this past week, I felt it myself. I stood in the emergency room beside the bedside of my good friend Radine Davis, anointed his head with oil. Just as he was breathing his last breaths, he had suffered this massive stroke out of the blue. And you feel like the bottom just drops out, and you wonder, how did we get here? and how we go on without him. We have all been there, is my point. And I think Luke tells us this story to remind us that what Easter means, really, is that when we are there, we're really not there by ourselves. And that makes all the difference. There is this stranger who's really not a stranger at all, walking with us. And though we don't always know and don't recognize it at the time, it's a presence that makes all the difference in the world. Some time back, I came across a good little book with the title The Dance of Hope. And the book is written by William Fry, who's a retired Episcopal bishop out in Colorado. And he recalls in that book how he once volunteered to read to an older college student named John, who was blind. One day, after he had established some rapport with this student, John, Bishop Fry said, I just felt the need to ask him. I said, John, how did you lose your eyesight? And the answer came back, well, I lost my sight in a chemical explosion when I was 13 years old. And still curious to hear more of the story, Fry said, well, what was that like for you? And John responded with brutal honesty, it felt like my life was over. I felt helpless. I hated God with all my heart. For the first 6 months, I did nothing but stay up in my room. I ate my meals all alone by my choice until a transformative moment in my life happened. One day, he said, my father came in my room and said, John, winter's coming and the storm windows need to be hung up. That's your job. I want you out of this room and I want those windows hung up by the time I get back this evening or else. And then he said my dad turned and walked out of the room and shut the door behind him. And John went on to say, I was so angry that he would think that I could do that he would give me that assignment. And on top of all that had already happened to me, I was beside myself. I said to myself, I'm so insulted that he would say that to me. Who does he think he is, and who does he think I am? I'm blind. I can't hang storm windows. I was so furious, I decided there was a way for me to get back at it. Just to show the utter futility of it all, I would go try to hang those windows, and I was sure to fall off the ladder, and then my dad would have a son who's not only blind, but paralyzed. And I said, that ought to make the point well enough. So out the room I went, and I felt my way down to the garage, and I found the windows and located through memory some of the tools I would need, and I even found the ladder. All the while, muttering under my breath, I'll show him. You want a blind, paralyzed son? You got it. But the story goes on that he got started, and lo and behold, he got the first window in, and it was kind of amazing to him that he was able to do it. He could visualize it. He could find the tools by feel, and he was able to get the lower windows in. And then he began to feel more energized rather than angry, and he put the ladder up, and lo and behold, was pleasantly surprised to see that he was able, blind that he was, to put in the upstairs windows. So he did another, and eventually all the windows in the house were in. He got them up before evening, and it became, he said, a new beginning for me. It was a springboard that changed my life and began to show me what was possible that I hadn't been able to see. And as John continued to tell the story, his eyes began to mist, and he said, it wasn't until 7 years later that I learned something else important about that day that changed me. And what I learned was that entire day, my father was no more than 3 or 4 feet away from me. He was shadowing me the whole time. Everywhere I went, up the ladder and down, he was right there behind. If I had fallen, he would have thrown himself to break my fall. He was as close as the air I was breathing, and I didn't recognize it. Fry said, for him it was an Easter moment, that the sense of having this presence that it's not always overpowering, but it's always empowering. Isn't that a good way to say it? The Easter presence of Christ is not overpowering, but it's empowering. Like a stranger turning to a friend who comes alongside them and says, here, let me walk with you. That's what happened to those folks on the Emmaus Road, it seems to me. Did not our hearts burn with us while he talked on the road? That's what they say when the story's over. And their depression had given way to energy and passion for life, just like John in that story. And they rose and went back to Jerusalem and shared what they knew. Now here, rather than just an ephemeral thought up there. The Lord has risen. Resurrection, folks, is not just an idle tale. It is a truth that is unfolding in life every day. It's not just about what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago. It's a very real presence seeking entrance into your life and mine right now. Amen.